This is Kevin Baker. His novel is Paradise Alley, and it is a many-charactered story that takes place in New York City and deals with the draft riots in 1863 during the Civil War. Let's start by having each of the authors talk about, can you get your history from reading a novel?
Well, I think you can get at least some of your history from reading a novel. I don't think you should rely upon any novel for it. I think you can get a good gist of something from a novel, though. It's a good starting point.
And also, could you talk about how your novel in particular reflects the history and then how it deviates from the historical record?
Well, mine is pretty close to the historical record. In fact, one of the main, a lot of the main plot points came from the historical record and were inspired by things that actually happened. The central story revolves around a Irish-American woman married to a black man in New York when these draft riots broke out and when these mobs of mostly Irish whites were going around trying to lynch and attack any blacks they could find. And she went out into the street to try to save the life of her son from one of the mobs. And this was something that actually happened, as did most of the book. And it's you can't make that up. I was lucky enough to find that story in the research, and that really inspired a lot of the novel. It's interesting what things can tell you about the time you're writing about. I mean, it's a constant problem in historical fiction. You can't just have somebody walk across and flip on a light switch. On the other hand, it can really give you ideas. You know, I mean, the period I'm writing in, 1863, the sewers of New York were so badly built that whenever it rained, blood and butcher's offal would come flowing up from them, and it wasn't uncommon to see little boys sailing paper boats in these pools of blood in the gutters. It tells you a lot about a society right there. Or things like the fact that you just wouldn't expect, like the fact that pigs still ran loose in the streets, which was considered a very horrible thing by a lot of people of the time. But it occurred to me a lot of this book is about the Irish immigrant experience, and a lot of these people were starving over there in the famine. When it came time to kill the pig, they tended to have one pig that they would use for whatever cash they needed. When it came time to kill the pig, that was a really horrible moment. It meant that if you didn't get someplace very quickly after that, you were going to starve to death. And then come over here and see these pigs running loose in the street, something that we would consider horrible. It probably seemed to them as if the streets were paved with gold to see that. So it can tip you off.
Maybe we could talk about some adventures in research, how long did it take you to do the research? Where did you get the idea from? And what were some of the pleasures of writing it and a difficulty?
Well, writing's never pleasurable exactly, but the research on this one took about 2 years. It was inspired in part by reading accounts of the draft riot in Herbert Asbury's Gangs of New York, which Scorsese's making into a movie that's going to be out this winter. There are many pleasures in finding out different things, finding how things worked at a time, finding stories. But it's always a difficult process trying to actually to take all this information and kind of cut it down into a usable story, to hone it into a story that people will want to read.
What about the other side, the character development? These books, each of them have wonderful characters, and Kevin has many characters, and some of the characters were historical and some weren't, I gather. So could you talk about developing characters?
Yeah, it's an interesting thing with characters. I used to say that the thing to remember about historical fiction was that customs change, but people stay the same. And I think to a certain degree that's true. People are motivated by the same basic things: love, greed, sex, money. You know. But on the other hand, I've come to wonder about that recently. Maybe the rituals we do, the customs with which we live, really does shape personality to a certain degree. I'm not certain if that's a fully 100% thing. But well, the way I developed the characters in this was really looking for historical prototypes, and being inspired by that, and then trying to imagine how these people would feel in these circumstances. How do you feel walking along a back road in Ireland when everybody, all your friends and neighbors are out there walking, trying to walk for their lives? You see bodies everywhere on the road. You're desperate to get off this island. How do you feel as a woman living in this little alleyway in the Lower East Side of Manhattan and knowing that a mob is about to descend upon you? There's the normal imagination that goes into any novelist's work.
Another thing related to that is that each of these novels focuses on a very dramatic moment in history or a dramatic thing that happened. And so maybe before we start taking your questions, could you talk about the architecture of making a novel? Usually when you're writing history, you may start at the beginning and continue chronologically, but in writing a novel, you have the issue and the work of making an architecture, and at least two don't start at the beginning. They have prologues that start right in the middle of the intense, most dramatic moments. So could you speak about that, the architecture of making it?
Well, yeah, I really battled a lot with the architecture of the whole thing because, you can't go wrong with a riot for drama. It's like sort of right there. So I had to try to figure, a way to do this. That was the kind of the easy part. But in writing some of the horrible things that happened in the riot, which is both mostly run and mostly put down by these Irish American immigrants, I had to think, like, who were these people who were doing these horrible things? How do I relate to them as people? How do I relate to them and put them in the American past? Where did they come from? Where did this brutality come from? Where did this courage to stand against your friends and neighbors and battle to maintain law and order come from? So I ended up having to do a lot of backstory then of these people coming out of the famine and kind of returning, always to the riot, to the central 3 days of the riot. So that it felt sort of dictated by that. When I originally tried it as sort of a straight chronology, but I find that really bogged down into the sort of historical fiction that, at least in my case, is becoming this kind of John Jakes thing of like, and then this happened, and then this, and it was the gold rush, and I wanted to avoid that.
Maybe Kevin, could you speak to it about the Gaelicisms?
Well, I put in a whole glossary here because I know I always like to at the end of it, because I know I always like to know what some of the words mean. It's an interesting thing too with the dialogue. You do have to cheat a little in historical novels. Like the last book I wrote, a novel called Dreamland, had a lot of young women garment workers in it who probably in reality talked all the time about really esoteric issues of socialism. And you have to kind of let on that they were socialists, that they were idealistic, but if you put all that in, the modern reader would just be bored silly. And that's one thing we try to avoid.
Did any of you consider writing your book in nonfiction? And if so, what made up your mind, and what do you see as the strengths and weaknesses of one versus the other?
Well, there were already several excellent nonfiction books about my subject out there, so I had to go somewhere. I think one of the things about historical fiction, I think in a way it's kind of a shame we even consider it the separate category. Like the ancient Greeks didn't consider the Iliad and the Odyssey historical fiction. They considered it founding myths of their civilization, which they could then take and use and play with as the case may be. And well, I think there is a great responsibility to truth in writing historical fiction. I think it's mostly the same thing that any writer has to truth. And I think that you can, it's incumbent upon us to take the great stories of our society and work them over and bring them out as stories that translate to people today as terrific tales. I think a tremendous amount of it is simply building the discipline. I started writing fiction in college, and it was kind of a damn fool thing to do, in the sense of I had all these great professors that I could access to and all this time to read that I would never have again in my life, and I should have been, studying much harder instead of trying to publish a novel then. But the one good thing about it was it did teach me how to sit down a couple hours at least every day, 4 or 5 hours on a good day, and just write and try to keep that up as a steady pace, and that's the heart of it.
May I ask one more?
Sure.
Do you have any specific comments about writers groups or getting published in magazines, things like that, that helped you when you were first starting out?
Well, I mean, the first job I ever had was covering schoolboy sports for local daily, and of course that helped. I mean, journalism helps a lot no matter what you're writing. It teaches you to be brief. Well, it's not too brief, but brief enough. You know, it helps in a lot of ways. I never did a writers group, which is probably, you know, kind of stupid vanity. I felt nobody could teach you to be a writer, and that's not true. They can teach you a lot of shortcuts. On the other hand, I've never been crazy about the idea of going into some classroom thing where, you know, a huge amount of the time would be taken up with people who are just starting off where you are, and you know, like getting the comments of other unpublished, you know, people who are maybe worse writers than you are about your writing never struck me as all that productive. But I'm sure there are many cases where it's helpful. You never know with reviewers. I was lucky enough on Paradise Alley to have Jeffrey Ward, a historian, review it, and he actually went and looked up my sources and assured readers that even the most outlandish things were true, which is great. You can't. On the other hand, I had on the last one on Dreamland, I had a reviewer who assured the readers that the gangster dialogue I had in there was ridiculous. You know, and it was from real sources. This is how they talked. You know, but some people sometimes assume a false erudition, which is annoying.
Do historical fiction writers research and write at the same time, or does a bell go off and it's, oh, I can write now because I know all I need to know?
I do a tremendous amount of research beforehand. I always find, though, that there's something more I need to find out, something lacking. You know, I don't do a lot of stuff in terms of, I don't look up like old ferry schedules and see like, aha, he was on the 645. But there's always something else, you know, I need to know, like what type of, you know, what would it be like firing this gun, or what would it be like in a house at that time. So I find it's constantly a process where I have to circle around. I'd agree. I remember still as a grammar school kid reading a book about these two children who ended up going back in time to Peter Stuyvesant's New York, and meeting Peter Stuyvesant fascinated me. And you know, to this day, I'll pick up a historical novel and get drawn into a time, maybe research it later. It's the whole reason we tell stories in fiction anyway. You know, to kind of ingest things, to explain things to ourselves, and history as well as anything else.
First, what's the dividing line between good historical fiction and a bad novel in that sense? And after you've done all this research and you've done all this writing about these historical characters, do you feel closer to them? I mean, do you feel that you know them almost?
I don't know. I don't know if there's any set way to determine what's good historical fiction or bad historical fiction, other than what's good writing and bad writing. I mean, I think when someone's made up something that's really offline in terms of what a character is about, and particularly a historical character, then that's then that shows up in the writing as well, because it doesn't make sense. I would like to think that is the hope that if you're sticking closer to the story, it's probably better fiction, but not all the time.